Okay, thank you. I will try to make it short. This is work in progress, and actually I'm just one of the authors. The other two authors are a couple of students, one in my university, another in the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. And this is about the relations between voting patterns, specifically about the popularity of the anti-establishment discourse and relation with economic factors, in particular with inequality and lack of opportunities. We are focusing on Spain because we have good data for that, but in particular, one database that I want to present here. But of course, it could be extended to, and our plan is to extend this to other European regions. Okay, some kind of context, because I like to frame this type of analysis in a broad, relatively broad branch of literature, kind of recent, that relates these political attitudes or voting patterns or whatever you want to call it with economic context. Okay, and there is a line of research, particularly in regional economics or economic geography, if you prefer, that goes on this direction because of the events that we had recently, both in Europe with Brexit or in the US with the Trump election, right? And we have this theory, for example, of Andrés Rodríguez Posse, the places that don't matter, and how these specific regions tend to favor some particular political positions, and our work lies on this frame. In particular, we try to do a couple of things here. The first one is try to quantify, just to put a number to the support for anti-establishment, protest, populist attitudes in Spain. And the second is try to relate this estimate of this support with some economic factors, as I was explaining, related to economic inequality and lack of opportunities. So this is the outline of my paper. I have just a couple of maps, 0 equations, but one table, a couple of tables actually, okay? I will try to make it short, especially in the more technical parts. There is a warning. I presented this same paper like 2 weeks ago in my department. It took me 2 hours. So if I finally make it in 15 minutes, I think it would be a new record on this. Okay. So the first thing is, what are we measuring on this paper? And I just gave you a flavor before. It's something related to this, how should I call it? This support to anti-establishment discourse, populist discourse, or protest parties in some part of the literature is labeled like that. And of course, there is not an univocal definition, but there are some, there have been some attempts in the relevant literature. I'm just an economist. I'm not an expert in political science, but we can find some reference for that. I think this book is one of the most well-known attempts to quantify this, the cultural backlash by Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart, on which they define populism in basically this, or characterized by these 2 dimensions. A message which is basically anti-establishment, anti-elite, power to the people, things like that. And well, their analysis is generally is not only focused on the European Union. You have the drawing there of Donald Trump, Le Pen, and Orban. But there have been recent attempts for the case of Europe. This is a recent paper published last year, yeah, on which they were trying to quantify, trying to classify European parties following the same ideas. And they were taking this set of dimensions that you have there, which, well, you can read on the slide, but it's basically the same idea as in the previous book that as I was presenting a minute ago. And this other recent paper that was published in Real Science, Policy and Practice last year as well, they were conducting a survey to classify again European parties according to this classification. So for example, given that I'm going to focus my presentation in the Spanish parties, they were using these dimensions that you have there. They classify parties as populist, some of them, some in the far right, some of the far left. And they also included an important dimension here, which is the position or the potential position anti-Europe, this Euroscepticism that they are recognizing there. Well, what they basically do, for example, in this paper, is kind of arbitrarily. I mean, I don't know if you know this, the Spanish scenario, but more or less everybody would agree that this is fairly okay, but it's kind of arbitrary, expert-based opinion. So we try to get rid of that and try to be as objective as possible in our classification of parties. So we rely on this database, the Chapel Hill Expert Survey database. It's the first time that I use this, but I found it very, very useful for our purposes, because basically this is a survey that is conducted every 3 years or so. It started in 2002, but we took the most recent data corresponding to 2019, on which there is a pool of experts, and they give scores to European parties across all the European Union, attending to different dimensions, okay? So in line with the dimensions that I was mentioning before, in an attempt to quantify this anti-establishment attitude, we take from the survey the following 3 dimensions that I am presenting here. The first one is this dimension of people versus elite. So these experts, in a scale from 0 to 10, they rank, give scores to the party. So 10 means that the discourse of these parties that, well, power should be given to the people, not to the representatives, and 0 is just the other way. They also consider what they call the anti-elite salience. So how important is this part of the discourse of the party? So if they put it in the front of their priorities. And the third dimension that we consider is the position about the European Union. Okay, this is on a scale from 1 to 7. 1 means that the party is strongly against European integration, let's say, European Union. 7 means that it's strongly in favor of the European Union. So, for example, just to visualize a bit the data, I don't know if you can read the letters, but this is just a scatter plot on which in the horizontal dimension, I have the European position. So the more to the right is the more pro-European, okay? In the vertical axis, I have the anti-elite discourse. So the higher is the more anti-elite this party is. So we have, for example, here, is a far party in Spain. Okay, so it's kind of anti-European and anti-elite. Podemos, for example, is similarly anti-elite, but more pro-European. Here we have a cluster of the more traditional parties, the Socialist Party, the Popular Party, plus some specific regional parties. By the way, for the case of Spain, the survey only covers 13. Oh. Yeah, it's working. Just to give you a reference, I just included in the scatter some other European countries, UK, Italy, and France. So for example, you can see that, well, this is the Front National in France, or I don't know, Fratelli d'Italia, or Lega Norte, Cinque Stelle movement here, right? So what is our story here? Our story is that we need to transform this into a number, into a quantity that considers not only these two, but the three dimensions that I was mentioning before, right? And what we did was to conduct a kind of standard technique for computing synthetic indicators, composite indicators, which is principal component analysis. Principal component analysis takes the information that you have on the sample and trying to keep as most of the original information as you have in the original three dimensions. They try to summarize, they try to project it into one single dimension. This is not a very technical description, but it's basically what I do here, right? So this is what we did. Okay, so basically imagine that we are averaging these three dimensions based on the weights that are produced by this statistical technique. And this gives me for each and every of the 13 parties that are covered in the survey for the Spanish part, I have a score of what I call anti-establishment. Okay, just to make interpretation easier, we scale this from 0 to 10. Actually, we apply this not only for the Spanish party, because probably you are seeing here that I have 277 observations. This is applied for the full sample of surveys, of parties for the survey, and we just extract the Spanish part, right? This is the list of the 13 Spanish parties that are covered. And if we apply our technique there, this is the result. So remember that everything is on a relative scale. It goes to 10, which is the most anti-establishment, which is Bildu. Bildu is a far left country, far left party specific of the Basque country. Basically, they were kind of supporting terrorism years ago. And on the other extreme is PSOE, Ciudadanos, and PP, which is the Popular Party. They were in the government of Spain. Around here, you have Vox, you have Podemos here, plus a bunch of parties supporting for independence of Catalonia, basically. It's a very brief summary, a lot of details there, but it's basically the message that we have there. Okay, so once we have calculated that, we try to put these numbers in a map of Spain, okay? And what we do here is combining this quantification with data coming from the most recent general elections that we have, 2019, okay? We have data with a great geographical detail. We take municipal scale as reference, but we could go even lower than that. I mean, we can go deeper than that, but we take municipal reference for our purposes. And this is simple because just taking the score that we get for each party times the share of votes that they are getting, this means that for one given municipality, I can calculate what is the average score of the anti-establishment discourse, right? If you follow me until here, this is relatively easy because this allows me to map, again, on a 0 to 10 scale, this support to anti-establishment discourse. So I don't put here the Iceland, but you can see a clear pattern here. Just because of the results that we are getting, you see this dark area in Catalonia, in the Basque country, Navarra, and this is not so clear, but around Madrid. Madrid is here at the center. Actually, it's this kind of lighter green, big area where the arrow is right now, and all these smaller municipalities around are darker. This is basically because of Vox popularity on these specific areas, right? So next step is trying to relate this, trying to explain this, basing on some indicator of inequality, lack of opportunity, as I was mentioning. So in order to do that, we combine this data with a kind of novel database that has been produced by a foundation, Fundación Felipe González, actually, on which what they do is to kind of estimate, to draw what they call the Atlas of Opportunities, okay? And this is really nice, at least if you are interested in this type of topics, because what they do is they take really big sample of individuals. So it's more than 1.6 individuals, a sample of income taxes in 2016. These individuals were aged between 13 and 19-year-olds in 2003. Okay, so in 2019 they were like 29 and 35 years old. Okay, and they are able to match their income with the household income that their parents had in 2003. I mean, when they were kids. So you end up with a database like this. So for example, this corresponds to the city of Oviedo, on which my university is located. And you are able to calculate for each percentile of the distribution of the parents' income, which is the mean percentile of the income of the kids. So for example, I don't know, if you take here percentile 37 for the parents in 2003, the mean percentile for the kids in 2016 were 50 points or so. It was more or less in the median, right? And this is very nice because, sorry about that, because it allows me municipality by municipality, not all the municipalities are there, because they are only considering those on which the sample size is enough. So instead of the original 8 and something thousand municipalities in Spain, our sample is restricted to more than 2,000 or so. So there are blanks in my maps. So you can calculate something like that. So this is a gap, which is the mean percentile of the parents with the mean percentile of the kids. So on these areas on which this gap is positive, this is indicating that the next generation is making less money that their parents were doing, and just the other way around. Please be aware that we cannot track where the kids actually live. So migration is possible, but this is not, I think, a big issue for us because we are just focusing on municipalities. So we are trying to quantify the opportunities that are given to the second generation, irrespectively of where they live, right? They could have migrated or not. So this is the map of the gap that I was explaining before. So the red means that the kids are doing worse. The blue means that the kids are doing better 15 years after, right? And of course, we have a lot of blanks because they are basically very small municipalities. But you can see here that there is a clear geographical pattern. So the northeast of Spain and the areas around Madrid are given more opportunities, while the south, and particularly the south west, these are places characterized for, well, lacking of opportunities to the next generation. So the idea is to take this indicator of lack of opportunities plus unemployment rates, plus an indicator of inequality in 2019, which is the reference year for the elections, and try to see if these three factors combined can explain something of the score for anti-establishment discourse that I was computing before, municipality by municipality. So we conduct a regression analysis we consider these three factors plus regional dummies as well, and all the interactions between my factors. And this interaction part is interesting because we were specifically interested on identifying non-linearities, right? So given all my interactions, this is not, actually this table is not very relevant. The relevant part are the marginal effects. When you have a linear model, the marginal effects are the coefficients that you have there. But when you have non-linearities, you need to evaluate this in a different way. And this are the average of the marginal effects. So you can see that apparently inequality, we estimate inequality by this ratio, the ratio between the percentile 80 by the percentile 20. This seems to indicate that the higher the inequality, the more support to anti-establishment. Something similar, but much smaller. I'm finishing. Happens with unemployment. And apparently the gap that we are calculating here is not relevant at all. But this is just on the average. If we evaluate the different marginal effects that we have here for inequality and unemployment across the different values of the gap, this gives me a different vision of the story. So basically, I'm going to be very brief here. Basically, this tells me that inequality is even more, or has even a greater effect on this anti-establishment if I have a big gap in favor of the parents. And something similar happens with unemployment. Unemployment is not important if the kids are doing better. But if you have places on which the kids are doing worse, and this is combined with high unemployment rates, this seems to favor anti-establishment. This was not my last slide. My last slide is this one, but this is basically my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Esteban. Thank you. We got them in the end. And Fernando next.
Thank you very much. And thank you for resisting all the day until now there. No? You are so brave. Okay, the presentation of Esteban is perfect for me because we continue in the same topic, more or less similar, but using another case, a totally different case, not the case of UK. This paper was very interesting for me for presenting in this final conference of Imajine because it's one example of the collaboration between the groups. In this paper, we collaborate with Maria Plotnikova, the people from Oviedo. We use the information of that we generate in the working package too. And also, some of the conclusions are related with what, starting with the team in Pescara, with Paolo and the team of Pescara about convergence. No? So it's talking about the Brexit referendum, no? And why we are especially interested in the Brexit. This is the thing that the Esteban presentations give me an opportunity to explain this very easily. No? You can see that these parties and these leaders that are growing across all the European geography have many things in common, but also have many differences between them. They are very similar, but also are very different between them. And the context for what in France or in Spain or in UK, these leaders grow and win elections and obtain very good results are totally different from one country to another. So it's true that there are some things in common between these parties, and probably if we check the characteristics of the parties and the leaders, the common thing for all these parties is they are anti-system, anti-globalization, but fundamentally anti-European Union. No? It's a position against the European Union. So that makes that the case of the Brexit referendum in UK is perfect. It's a perfect case because in this case, all the variety, all the small things that differentiate one from another and all the context disappear. The decision is just, I am against the European Union or I am in favor of the European Union. It's a very simple decision. No? All the parties are aligned. You are against or you are in favor of the European Union. So you can classify the parties with a clear line from this line to here, all the anti-system, anti-European parties, and this line to here is all the parties that are pro-system, pro-European Union. No? So that's the reason why probably the Brexit is the case that accumulate more studies and more analysis. And we learn a lot of things from the case of the Brexit. No? Some of the things that we learned in the previous literature is that the vote against the European Union increase with the age. Older people vote more against the European Union. Decrease with the qualification of the people. The more qualification is, the higher is the qualification of the people, lower is the support of leaving the European Union. It's more complex, the relationship between immigration and the decision related with the European Union, but generally the presence of a high number of immigrants generate a position against the European Union normally. And from the economical point of view, it's very interesting because we can see very clearly that when there are big wage or economical inequalities, the support of the living option is much higher. And also we can see that when there is problems with employment or the possibilities of being employed or progress in the labor market, there are more positions against the European Union. So from this idea is what appears the interesting idea that there is a geography of discontent. If there is a concentration of regions, areas in which there are more problems with employment, there are more inequalities, probably this area is concentrated also more position against the European Union, more positions against the system. No? This is the interesting idea that proposed Rodriguez Pose with this suggesting idea that these places that doesn't matter, places without opportunities, without good jobs, without hope, these are the places that are going to revenge to the system, and particularly are going to revenge to the European Union. So if you put to these places the possibility of vote against the European Union, probably many people, many population is going to vote against the European Union. No? Even considering that probably the European Union helps, especially to these places. It's not connecting the two things. No? Probably the European Union is fundamental to the progress of these places, but it's the places in which the position against the European Union is stronger. No? So this is the ideas that in general were tested from several perspectives for the case of the Brexit. And what we want to propose, what we want to analyze is these ideas, but using a more disaggregated information, using local information, not at regional level, working at a very local level. No? It's clear that the vote, if we use information at local level, by counties, by municipalities, is not aleatorily distributed in the country. There are clear concentrations of the votes against or in favor of the European Union. No? But if we work at the regional level, we lose a lot of information and we cannot observe very interesting things that are happening at the local level, especially in the surroundings of the metropolitan area of London. No? So considering all these things, our proposals in this paper is trying to observe what happened at the local level, trying to observe what are the variables that can explain the position against the European Union at this local level. The problem is that some of the key data, some of the key variables are not available at this level of disaggregation. And this is the moment in which appear the relevance of this project, the relevance of Imajine project. No? One of the objectives of Imajine project is provide information, relevant information, such as poverty or income levels at very local level. No? So combining the information, well, this is the methodology. I don't want to enter in this part because we explained this part. We know Esteban and Anna explained this part several times in different occasions within the project. But the thing is that this approach allows us to, departing from a map like this, a map in which you can observe the differences in income or in other economical relevant variables at regional level, you can go to a map like this, in which you can observe these differences at very local level. No? So we can use this information only for the UK case, and you can see in this map how is the distribution at local level of the income in 2011 in the United Kingdom. No? And we can connect this with the vote of the Brexit, no? The vote for leaving the Brexit. And it's clear that there is some kind of relationship. No? It's clear that the places in which the vote is in favor of the European Union normally are the places that have highest level of income, and otherwise it also happens. No? So for testing this idea, what we propose is a spatial model, a spatial econometrics model, in which we use all the information that we have at very local level, information about the structures, the economic structure by sector, the occupation, what is the level of employment in this municipality, the characteristics of the labor markets, the characteristics of education of the population, demographic characteristics. Also, we introduce some information about the age of the people and other demographic information, and two very important variables, the intra-local inequalities and also the inequalities with the surrounding municipalities. This is a particularly interesting index because we propose an index in which we compare the income of each local area, of each municipality, with the income of the 15 municipalities that are surrounding these local areas. So the idea is if this index takes the negative value, means that this area is below the neighbors. And if it takes the positive values, means that this area is above the neighbors. So it's a way of observing how the position with the closer ones, not the position with the entire country or distant regions, the position with the municipalities that are very close to you, what is the influence of this position, economic position with these municipalities to the decision of vote against or in favor of the European Union. So the results appear in this table. I put this table just to observe the general variables with the spatial Darwin model. After checking different spatial models, we use the spatial Darwin model that is more useful for this estimation, for the characteristic of this data. But for interpretation of the variables, it's better to use the direct and indirect effects. And it's interesting, but because at this local level in which we work, in general, we observe that most of the conclusions that were obtained at regional levels are also obtained at local level. For example, the age of the populations have a positive things that implies that those areas, those local areas that are older in average, are the areas that support more the living option. No? We also observe that when there are a lot of workers with low skills capacities, these areas is also against the European Union. No? But also happens if the economy is more based in manufacturing, also is against the European Union. No? But if we observe a sector like information and communication that requires higher levels of formation and qualifications, we observe that this is when there is a lot of workers in information and communication, they are against. Sorry, it's complicated. It's in favor of the European Union. No? These areas are in favor of the European Union. But it's interesting that this model allows to see what is the influence not only of the local area, also the influence of the behavior of the surrounding areas. And we can see that, for example, just to take one thing, if we have a municipality with high levels of education, high levels of education in doctoral studies and these kind of things, they are supporting more the option of maintain or remain in the European Union. But if the municipalities of the surroundings are the ones that have this kind of formation, bigger than me, so I decide as a municipality, this municipality is against the European Union. So it's interesting to see that the municipalities are comparing himself with the neighbors. And depending on my position with the neighbors, change the minds regarding with the European Union. The variable that allows us to observe this more clearly is the variable of the difference income with the neighborhoods. This variable, if they takes in the estimation a negative sense, means that when your income characteristics are lower than your neighbors, you are more against the European Union. Your position is against the European Union. So the conclusions that we obtain for this analysis is basically, first, that at local level, most of the conclusions that were obtained at regional level are maintained. All the conclusions that we obtained related with the age, related with the qualification of the population, related with the structural economy, labor opportunities, all these characteristics are maintained at a very local level. But we observe something that is very interesting, that at local level, when we working at local level, is very interesting that the position that my municipality has regarding with the municipalities of the closest municipalities change my mind with respect to the European Union. This is the hypothesis that Phil McCann calls the idea that I am against the metropolitan elite. If this is good from the elite that is living in the metropolitan areas, London, Birmingham, wherever, that means that it's bad for me. No, it's bad for my municipality. No? That is not true, but this is the idea. No? Another interesting thing is from the this spatial dimension at very local level, we observe that it's very interesting to have a cohesion at this local level. If we obtain a cohesion at a regional level, but the result is that this cohesion at regional level or national level implies differences, implies divergence at local level, probably is going to generate a sentiment, a feeling against the European Union. Probably this is the most interesting conclusion, and this is what connects with the work of the working package 3, the people from Pescara, because what we observe in the analysis of convergence, especially if we use a multi-level convergence, is that it's possible to obtain a convergence with the European Union, making that the richer regions grow faster. In the case of Spain, for example, in the case of UK, UK can grow very fast if we put all the resources in the biggest cities, in London, in Birmingham, in the main cities. In the case of Spain, Spain can converge very fast with the European Union if we put the resources in Madrid, in Barcelona. But that is going to imply a higher internal divergence. And this is very dangerous, because if we converge, if we grow as a nation, as a region, but generating divergence inside of the nation, probably is going to be the perfect condition for generating an anti-system, anti-European Union sentiment, the European Union feeling. So this is the ideas. The interesting thing, I finish with this, is just one slide or two slides. The interesting thing is that Brexit only happens one time, at least by the moment. No? But there are other opportunities that are very similar to the Brexit to study other cases and to see if these things that happen in the United Kingdom happens in other countries. And the last opportunity that the reality gives to us is the case of France. We don't have a referendum in France, but the second round of the elections in France is similar to a referendum. It's basically a referendum, because the two options was basically different, because one of the options is pro-European Union and the other option is against of the European Union. It's the main difference. And all the small difference between the rest of the parties are aligned with these two options. You are against of the European Union, so you go with Le Pen, or you are in favor of the European Union, so you go with Macron. And you don't have more options. No? So it's the most similar thing of a referendum without being a referendum. No? And it's interesting because if we put together the map of the elections in France and the map that we obtain in the Imajine project of the income, is even more interesting than the case of the case of the UK. In this case, we can see that the poorest region of France are not the ones that support more the option of Le Pen. It's the areas that are surrounding Paris, the ones that support more Le Pen. This idea that the closest areas to Paris with lower levels of income probably is the ones that support more a referendum against the European Union. So this is the next step, I suppose, to study the case of France and compare the case of France with the case of Spain. And I expect not having more opportunities of checking another referendums. And finally, thank you very much for your attention, and especially thank you very much for these years sharing with you all this time with this project. It was a great pleasure to having this opportunity of work with all these fantastic teams. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we'll move on quickly, and we're going to stay with a political perspective, and Patrick, who's going to talk some of the analysis which links to work package 7 of Imajine.
All right, thanks a lot. Now I come up here as a political scientist to lecture our economic colleagues of how complicated populism and Euroscepticism actually is, and that it should all be much more fine-grained, and I will mansplain it in an all-male panel. But I'm not really in a position to stand on a high horse either, because this is also very early stage and there are some serious flaws in there as well. But I'm happy to have a chat about my thoughts and what you were presenting earlier over a coffee. What I'm doing here now is to basically present some initial ideas for a paper that are based on work package 7. And basically the starting point for this paper, or for this idea, is the finding that regionalist parties have increasingly shifted to demand independence over other demands for territorial restructuring. For instance, territorial autonomy or an increase in competencies of the regional level. So independence has become really much more of a salient demand in the 2010s. And we see on this slide as well, with the red line, that those demands for independence are very much addressing the state from which these parties want to secede. We see that in the 1990s and in the 2000s, the European Union almost amounted for 50% of all these demands for independence as well. But then in the 2010s, we see that the state really is becoming the focus, and that the European Union as an addressee for independence demands really loses out in its relevance. And the question was then obviously, why is that? So basically, or how we wanted to explore this was based on the data set that we put together as part of work package 7. I will just quickly summarize what we did here. We were basically observing the time period from 1990 to 2021. And we were looking at regionalist parties from a variety of regions in Europe. I have to acknowledge there's some very important cases missing, like Flanders or the Basque Country, but we were looking at Scotland, Wales, Catalonia, Galicia, northern Italy. So basically the heartland of the Lega Nord, Bavaria, Sardinia, and Corsica. And we coded 520 documents. So this, we also included other cases, but those are the cases where we see demands for independence with varying intensities. And based on the data set that resulted from there, just a few more remarks on the data set. So we differentiated between a variety of different territorial demands, as I said, either for independence or various degrees of autonomy, or also for policy intervention in the region by higher levels of government. And then we coded these territorial demands depending on which level in the EU's multi-level system is being addressed. So we differentiated between demands that are focusing on the region, the state, the European Union, or the international level. And the regional and the international level are basically irrelevant. And as I was saying earlier, the state is the main addressee of these claims, but the European Union is also important. But we were wondering, why do we see a change in how independentist parties are addressing the European Union over time? And our hypothesis is basically that independentist parties adopted what we call the EU's new realism. I'm not entirely happy with that terminology, but for lack of a better term, we stuck with it for now. And it's basically an argument that comes in two steps. So the first step is that before the 2010s, independentist parties kind of hypothesized about how the European Union might be useful to their territorial project. And there are basically three strategies. The first one being independence in Europe, very much the argument that the SNP, the Scottish National Party, has been putting forward since the 90s, which means that European integration is somewhat a facilitator for independence because Scotland doesn't need all the institutions of an independent state, but it can draw on already existing policies such as currency or defense if Scotland became independent. The second one is Euroscepticism, and this is an argument that's very much, that has been put forward by the far left, but also increasingly by the far right, basically saying that the European Union is perpetuating borders in their current state. It is reinforcing the territorial integrity of existing states, so independence can really only be achieved outside the European Union. That was, for instance, an argument that Sinn Féin in Ireland was putting forward in the 70s already, and in various guises, the Lega Nord in Italy in the 90s as well, or in the 2000s rather. And then kind of a blurry path in between is what I call post-sovereign regionalism, basically the aspiration that a Europe of the region kind of makes states obsolete and that independence will come about almost naturally as the European Union and regions become more and more important and states just fade away. Now, the thing is, all these three strategies before the 2010s were just basically some ideological hypotheses, and parties never had to put these ideas to the test. But as independence claims intensified in the 2010s, we increasingly gathered evidence, and parties also started realizing that there are limitations to these strategies. And this is where they start noticing this new realism that we are alluding to here. And this new realism also basically constrains all three strategies, and it has three elements to it. The first thing is the impossibility of independence in Europe. So basically that is the result of Catalonia's strive for independence and the European Union institutions being relatively clear that if Catalonia left Spain without any consensus, they would also drop out of the European Union. They hadn't been clear about that before, but that was basically the subtle message that they sent out. And we saw similar arguments in relation to the Scottish independence referendum, where continued EU membership would also not have been guaranteed. The second element of the new realism is the complexity of withdrawal, as we have seen with Brexit, where even one of the largest and wealthiest member states was really struggling to disassemble those interdependencies that have been created as a result of European integration. And we also see it in, say, smaller attempts of withdrawing from the European project, for instance, by populist governments in Italy, for instance, when they wanted to introduce a parallel currency to the euro, which was basically undermined as well. And then the third element is something that has been developing over a longer period of time, which are essentially the limits to the Europe of the region, which is when parties started realizing that as a subsequent treaty revisions that reformed the European Union did basically not strengthen regions, but really enforced, on the one hand, member states, and on the other hand, supranational institutions, but regions really left out and did not really move anywhere closer to a more relevant status at the European level. So independentist parties needed to adopt or need to adopt do this new realism, and the question was how they do this. And yeah, basically how they do this and which strategy they choose as their three former strategies are becoming increasingly obsolete. We measure this new realism, and this is again something where I'm not quite happy about it, and I'm happy for any suggestions that you might have. We basically measure the new realism by what has been happening in the second half of the 2010s, because this is basically when Brexit happened and when the situation in Catalonia intensified. It's not an ideal measure, but it's as close as we could get so far. And what we see is that there are basically two different pathways that independentist parties have been choosing since the 2015. So basically we see up here that parties in the UK, so the SNP and Plaid Cymru, have intensified their engagement with the European Union. So they talk more about independence in the context of the EU, whereas all other parties in Europe basically decreased the salience of the EU. So they frame independence much more in relation to the state. So our hypothesis is that depending on which aspect of the new realism parties are more exposed to, that basically defines which strategy to use to counter this new realism in a way. And there's also qualitative differences in the sense that the SNP and Plaid Cymru, so the parties in the UK, idealize the European Union, and they still are very much, especially the SNP, are still very much committed to independence in Europe. And this independence is idealized in a sense that the disadvantages of being in the EU, which the SNP has been very clear about earlier as well, for instance, when it comes to fisheries, they are not highlighted anymore. The main thing that matters is that Scotland stays in the EU as an independent country. We see similar arguments in Wales, but there we also see, as opposed to Scotland, much more of an emphasis on policy intervention on part of the EU. And again, the EU here is portrayed very, very positively. Whereas in the remaining EU member states, secessionist parties like in Catalonia, even when there are calls for independence in Europe, Europe is now seen increasingly critical because the EU has basically not helped Catalonia after the 2017 referendum. What we do see in the remaining EU 27 is much more of an emphasis on calls for the EU to intervene in regional policies. And that mainly comes as a call for recognition of regional particularities. So in Catalonia, it is we call on the EU to recognize the right to self-determination, or in Galicia, it is the right to, or the call for recognition of regional economic or socioeconomic particularities, for instance. So basically, to sum up, as I said earlier, demands for secession are on the rise in Western Europe, but the EU plays increasingly a smaller role in how this independence is being justified and how the strategies are being applied. The exception are the parties in the EU, in the UK, sorry, and I guess this begs the question of how the EU might respond to those different approaches that parties take vis-a-vis the integration process, especially when we think about processes of differentiated integration that might also become relevant when we look at further accession or closer association of other states in Central and Eastern Europe. And yeah, basically leave it there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. And we'll move on to the final speaker, who is Sean. Again, Sean's going to be speaking to research which came out of Work Package 6 in Imajine.
Thanks, everyone. So this is, I think, the most graveyard slot I've ever spoken in. So I'm going to try and be really, really quick to give you time to sum up at the end. And I realize that's a cliche by this point, but I think I'll manage it. So this paper is entitled Policy Design for Territorial Equity in Multi-Level and Multi-Sectoral Political Systems. So Mike makes the link there to Work Package 6, which I think should be relatively obvious. But really the aim here was to compare health equity and health education strategies seen through the prism of spatial and territorial inequalities. So the paper, I'm presenting the paper today, but it's co-authored with Paul Cairney, who I think most of you, if not all of you know, Emily St Denny and Heather Mitchell, who've been our sort of research team on work package 6 at the University of Stirling and now beyond at Copenhagen in Emily's case. So like I say, I'm going to skip through pretty quickly if I can get on to the next slide. The aim of the paper was to establish how intersectoral equity initiatives and multi-level policymaking contribute to policies designed to reduce territorial inequalities. So it's bringing a focus onto those kind of main public services and the way that equity scholars kind of conceive and conceptualize the inequalities that they research through the prism, like I say, of territorial inequalities and also policy theory. So the abstract is there. I'll save time by not reading it all, but I've highlighted, again, that sort of key point of what the paper is trying to do. So we're analyzing 2 sectoral strategies to identify their implication for spatial justice strategies. And I've included the, I'm not sure if these slides are going to be posted anywhere, but the link to the paper, which has been published in Regional Science, Policy and Practice is there. So some immediate challenges in approaching this kind of work is that there's no sort of overarching equity reference point. There's ambiguity and there is contestation. And we can identify that in the meaning of key terms like spatial justice and territorial cohesion. Even if there's kind of official definitions, the way that they're filtered through different policymaking contexts, different institutions, different political actors' understandings will create a sort of degree of subjectivity and flux. And then another issue is that responsibility for relevant policy in these areas is shared across different governmental levels and sectors. So, you know, while we might think of health policy as something which concerns primarily things like hospitals and doctors, and education policy is encompassing primarily teachers and universities, actually responsibility for relevant policy instruments is shared right across the system because of the, you know, complexity and interactivity of policy. And to sort of illustrate that second point, I don't know how well you can see that, but hopefully what you can see is a big list of different policy area responsibilities, which I won't go into any particular depth with, but that's the example of education policy in the Netherlands. So our task, this table isn't actually in the paper, but it's in the book that I described earlier and is relevant to the research here. And this was an attempt to map the different relevant policymaking responsibilities vis-a-vis education policy. This health policy rather in the Netherlands. So you know, you can sort of see the vertical dimension there down the left-hand side, the different levels, EU, national, regional, and local, and then the direct and indirect competences are on the right-hand side there as well. So what we can see there is it's a complicated mix. So when you start talking about things like coordination, when you start talking about things like getting objectives aligned, you can see the challenge inherent in doing that. And I think that table brings the message across. Incidentally, if you like tables like that, then you're going to really like the book. This paper also builds on other Imajine work. Published Imajine work has explored the connection between some of the authors of these papers are in this room, between vague EU territorial cohesion aims, the limited progress in economic and political terms towards those aims, and the search for alternatives to that approach. And the best example for that is a shift towards the kind of distributional measure in terms of things like GDP, towards a focus on the sort of procedural dynamic in terms of equal access to services. Secondly, we can also see in published Imajine work an impact of multi-level policymaking on a vague policy agenda. And there we have the sort of eternal policymaking factors of, you know, ambiguity, the multiple different ways to frame any given policy issue or problem, incoherence, different bits of the system acting in conflict with one another and creating an overall picture of incoherence, something which is sort of encouraged by multi-level governance in some ways. And silos, you know, sort of siloed off parts of the policymaking system that don't necessarily speak to one another, and decentralization as a part of that as well. So 3 common elements here to this work that we're building upon is a sort of fuzziness and ambiguity, aids in the creation of agreement and consensus, but it has the effect of undermining delivery. That's because it's very easy to sign up to sort of vaguely worded aspirations, but when those things start, the business of politics starts creeping in and you start talking about these things in terms of winners and losers, the sort of finite resources and things like that, the difficult choices involved therein, it becomes a bit more difficult to maintain that consensus. They're often relatively vague, so much so as to occasionally be contradictory. For instance, do things like aspirations for territorial coherence and so on, do they necessarily entail centralized action because of the implication for sort of standardized, for overarching standards in a national polity? Or do they encourage sort of decentralization and with that the kind of potential for a wide degree of diversity in the way that policies are delivered? And then thirdly, do these strategies complement each other? And then probably more importantly here, routine government business. So, I mean, what happens when these aspirations clash with other government priorities, such as the kind of constant need to maintain economic growth and to keep key political constituencies happy? So we're trying to sort of build on this as our sort of background. So a key reframing of territorial cohesion has been a sort of equal access to public services. And yet, you see how quickly I'm rattling through these because I had more to say about that. Each key service, for example, in this case, health and education, has its own equity ideas and reference points. There are sectoral approaches to equity, but there's also intersectoral action. So I'll move on to the sort of substance of the paper now. This builds upon, or this sort of extrapolates from two large systematic reviews led by Paul Cairney, one of which I was involved with, the other was with Emily St Denny and Heather Mitchell. These are 25,000 words reviews of global equity policy research in health and education, and there's links in these slides to those too, I think, at the end. But these were sort of an attempt to generate an interdisciplinary approach using policy theories to interpret empirical data produced by health and education researchers, and to relate these back to insights on spatial justice from geographic research. So they're very, very long, 50,000 words in total, and we've tried to sort of bring some of the key lessons out here. So with regard to health, we asked the question, where are public services in the health in all policies story? So health in all policies is a sort of attempt to basically mainstream health policy, to orient a kind of concern for public health and health across the sort of plethora of government policy. So the high-up story that we can identify is that health is a human right, that you need to identify evidence of the social determinants of health inequalities. So for example, rather than looking at hospitals and so on, you'd look at things like access to housing, clean air, employment opportunities, because these are the things that downstream will create bad health outcomes. And then to identify evidence-based upstream solutions. So the obvious corollary to the points contained in number 2 there are, providing housing and employment opportunities. And these are the things that will really sort of enhance public health, which isn't to say that things like doctors and so on aren't considered to be important. And then to promote intersectoral action and collaborative governance, because the most important policies affecting health, like I say, are not necessarily in the gift of health departments. So cast your mind back to that table from that earlier slide. I think that also illustrates that point quite well. So that's what's going on in health. What about the education equity researchers? So we can find two competing stories of equity in this sort of research. One is a neoliberal approach. I haven't heard the word neoliberal very much today. And I think, there's sort of a tendency to be a bit squeamish about it sometimes, but it comes up in this literature review time and time again. And this was characterized as the neoliberal approach, sees education sort of in largely instrumental terms as being for human capital, economic growth, competitiveness. What can the education system contribute to a national economy? Equity is represented in this sort of characterization as equal access to high quality services, such as schools. And then there's a kind of link through there to the based on merit argument, a kind of meritocratic conception of education. And you can foster equal access and quality via quasi-market measures and performance management, which can sort of be roughly summed up as being reforms which exist in the kind of new public management kind of category. And that's things like competition between schools, the involvement of the private sector, quite rigorous testing, school rankings, and so on and so forth. So this is the kind of, these are the bad guys basically in this conception of education equity. The good guys, meanwhile, are the social justice approach, social justice warriors, I suppose you could call them. And in the social justice account, we see education as being primarily for enlightenment and emancipation. So sort of intrinsic argument rather than the instrumental argument of neoliberal approaches. Equity is the achievement of more equal outcomes, which is fostered by state intervention. And there's a commonality here, which I'll come on to a bit more in a second, by focusing on out-of-school factors, which is sort of analogous to the sort of social determinants of health and the redistribution of school resources. And you can see the full review goes into far more detail on these things, but that's the sort of broad story of these reviews. So there are differences and similarities between the two, but both contrast their preferred approaches in different ways to neoliberalism. In health, HIAP studies describe a coherent and well-supported plan undermined by a greater commitment to neoliberal policies. So that's to sort of say you can have a high commitment to health in all policies, but what will happen when economic growth is threatened and you know, you sort of know what the trade-off is likely to be there. It'll be the health-focused policies that are relinquished in most cases. The spectre of neoliberalism, in other words, is external to public health policy networks. That's contrasted with education, where most research describes the marginalization of the social justice approach and the ascendance followed by the dominance of the neoliberal approach within education networks. So this neoliberal conception of social justice, of education equity, rather, has sort of taken over from within with the facilitation of governments, tends to be how it's sort of described. So I did promise to whip through them on 13 minutes and 29 seconds. So I might sort of let out a big yawn and see if I can make it last 90 seconds. So both approaches warn against equating spatial justice with equal access to public services, instead stressing broader contextual factors. Each approach highlights different tensions in the balance between centralization and decentralization, but both conclude that multi-level governance is not necessarily an effective vehicle for cohesive equity policies. For those reasons, that there's sort of ambiguity between who's in charge and the high potential when you delegate down to lower levels of government for policy incoherence. And a focus on equity and justice appears to offer hope for radical policy change. But in practice, these initiatives often become incorporated within routine ways of doing things. The commitment, in other words, is there to these intersectoral strategies, but often isn't followed through with concrete policy action, which I think is basically what I said earlier. So anyway, I'm very happy to finish just about on time, and thank you very much for listening.